All right, we're going to continue our discussion about World War I, sort of the second phase of the war where the U.S. enters. So in this section, we will talk about how World War I becomes a total war, something we talked a little bit about earlier. We'll talk about how the U.S. enters the war. What are the reasons why the U.S. enters the war, and how does that tip the balance in the favor of the Allies? We'll look at the impact of the war in terms of financial costs, in terms of significantly high casualty rates, the most devastating war the world had seen at this point, and certainly the political impact in different countries around the world as well. We will, in the second part of this section, talk about what happens, what are the key issues and concerns at the Paris Peace Conference, what are the proposals that U.S. President Woodrow Wilson brings to Paris in his 14 points, and then we'll look at on the back end the terms of the peace that comes out of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles. And many people say that the ending of World War I with the Treaty of Versailles is actually a reason and a beginning that leads to Hitler and World War II. All right, so let's set the page here. We started the war, remember, in 1914. By 1917, the strain of the war on these countries in Europe has been significant, and they're beginning to show some cracks. The casualties, and again, that's injuries and deaths, on the battle lines have been significant. There are shortages in consumer goods, food, and the like back home, and this glorification of war that we talked about in the beginning is definitely beginning to decline, and the morale is sinking in these European countries. As this stalemate, especially on the Western Front with trench warfare, continues, there's no foreseeable end to it. As we move forward, when Russia exits the war and makes their own peace, separate peace with Germany, Germany for a short time gains ground against the Allies because the Germans no longer have to fight on both an Eastern Front and a Western Front, and we'll look at that in more detail here in just a bit. Once the Americans join the war on the side of the Allies, they're able to push the Germans back, take away any of those gains that they might have made in France and Belgium, to the point where the Germans finally recognized, German generals finally recognized and informed their government that they would not be able to be successful in the war. So we mentioned this concept in an earlier section. The nations involved in World War I needed to commit to a strategy that was total war to support this mechanized war. So again, total war means all of the resources of your country are focused on the war effort. So how did they do that? Well, a couple things we want to highlight. Number one, each of these countries imposed military conscription, which is a military draft. So certainly they took volunteers, but they also mandated that their young men serve in the military. They set up systems, converted factories to build arms, to transport those weapons and jeeps and tanks and things to the troops on the front, and supply food and other necessary items to their armies. Back home, they raised taxes because, again, it's very expensive to fight a war. So they raised taxes on their people. They borrowed money. A lot of money certainly was borrowed from the United States by the Allies, but they borrowed money from other countries in order to finance the effort. Back home, they rationed food, gasoline, and other products. Again, the idea is to have as much of that material, of those resources, going to the troops and the front lines. So they tried to limit what consumers were consuming. And these governments became much more like command economies. So the government stepped in and set prices so that goods would not get to be too expensive. They forbade labor strikes because the last thing you want in a factory that's making tanks or that's making jeeps is to have those workers go on strike and those goods not make it to the front lines. So the government steps in, takes some direct command control of industry, and all those resources are focused on providing for the troops. Now, international law. So again, international law is going to be laws that apply to all countries that they agree to, even in times of war. So international law agreed or allowed for naval blockades. So allowed one country to put its ships around another country, provide a blockade, and confiscate what's called contraband. And what is contraband? Well, contraband are military supplies or the raw materials that go into making material supplies. So international law allows countries to block contraband from getting into a country. That makes sense. But not items such as food. So if one country is shipping food to another country, an enemy is, by international law, not supposed to block that food from making it into the country. Well, in World War I, the British Navy really overstepped international law in this time. So they used their ships, their navy, to block any ships that were carrying goods to Germany, specifically food for the German civilian population. And as a result, many Germans during World War I went hungry because of Britain's blockade. In reaction to that, in 1915, Germany said that it would use its submarines, its U-boats, to sink all ships that were carrying goods to Britain. So this is their reaction to the blockade. So using submarines to sink not only ships that were carrying military supplies and raw materials to Britain for manufacture, but also other resources, food included. So merchant ships on their way to the Allies, to Britain specifically, were sunk in great numbers by German submarines. In 1915, as a result of these German efforts, a German U-boat torpedoed and sank a British cruise ship, a British passenger ship called the Lusitania. Now, the Lusitania, again, was a British ship, and it was arguably a passenger ship. There were about 1,200 passengers on the ship, including, importantly, 128 Americans. Now, the argument goes that the Germans said, well, this ship was carrying weapons from the United States to Britain. Well, at the time, that was vehemently denied by the ship company, but the Germans justified their actions based on their belief that there was contraband on the ship. What we know now, years after the fact, was that, in fact, the Germans were right. There were weapons in the hold of the Lusitania. So one of the things that makes this event important is not only the number of lives that are lost, the 1,200 passengers who are lost, but those 128 Americans. And many people thought, and certainly it started to raise the anger of people in the United States against the Germans, but many thought that this was going to be, this 128 Americans that are killed would be the event that draws the U.S. into the war. Now, U.S. president at the time was Woodrow Wilson. He initially threatens to cut off diplomatic relations with Germany. He was very much an isolationist. He did not want the United States to get involved in this European war. So he threatens to break off diplomatic relations over the issue, and the Germans, recognizing the potential danger to their effort of the United States entering the war, agrees that in the future, in the short term at least, they would warn any passenger ships before they fired upon them, and as a result, submarine warfare for a time, at least, subsided significantly. So the Lusitania, the sinking of the Lusitania, does not draw the United States into the war. Now, both the Central Powers and the Allies in the conflict used propaganda in their war efforts. So again, propaganda is the spreading of ideas to promote your own cause or to damage the cause of your opponents. So both sides are using propaganda. So in this case, they're encouraging civilians to enlist in the military or to loan money to the government, and that would be in the purchase of war bonds, or sometimes Liberty bonds, as they were called. So a Liberty bond, a war bond might be, I would buy a Liberty bond for $50. That $50 would go to the government to use for the war effort. At some point down the road, they would pay me back that $50 plus some interest. So war bonds, we'll see that a lot in World War II as well. Both sides played up and overly dramatized, really, the atrocities that were committed by the opposing side. So you can see there the Huns, or the Germans, they're made to look almost evil in their look. And that happened on both sides. So you demonize your opponent in order to increase morale and to increase focus back home and among your own troops. We also saw governments, to a significant degree, censor the press. So make sure that morale stays positive, that there wasn't all negative news printed in the press, but also it had a tactical purpose as well. You didn't want your enemy to be able to read in the newspaper or a little bit later hear on the radio where your troops were headed, or what your strategy, what your strategic plan would be. So again, propaganda used both to further your own cause, to denigrate your opponent's cause, and also to control the message that gets out there to the public. So this effort by the World War I powers of total war meant that women had to take some responsibility and step up, and they certainly did. Women had to take over jobs that men had so that the men could go off and serve and fight in the military. So women played a significant role in Europe and also in the U.S. once the U.S. enters the war. So women worked in war industries. So they worked in the factories as the men went off to fight. In manufacturing, they worked in nursing, certainly, both back home but also in the medical facilities closer to the front. They had a significant role in farming, because someone has to grow the food for the population and for the troops to eat. And they also served other secondary roles in the armed forces. They weren't fighting on the front lines necessarily, but they were right there behind the front lines, whether it's in a medical capacity or some other capacity to help the war effort. So women make a significant contribution in World War I, to the point where, after the war ends, in most of these Western countries, the women finally, from their governments, get the right to vote. And we'll see that happen in the United States as well. So in 1917, things are kind of at their lowest point. Morale is low. Soldiers in several countries begin to mutiny, to rise up, to desert their troops, or in some cases revolt against their governments. And there were significant calls to settle this thing, to make some peace. In Russia specifically, and we'll talk about Russia and the Russian Revolution in, I believe, the next section, things weren't going well for Russia, as we mentioned before. Protests back home against the human losses suffered by Russia in World War I, against the lack of food, leads to a revolution that brings down the Tsar and the royal family in Russia. And then early in 1918, Russia's new leadership signs its own separate peace with Germany. So they pull out of the war in 1918, and that's the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. So Russia makes its own separate peace with Germany before the war ends, and Russia pulls out of the war. So what that means, with Russia pulling out of the war, Germany no longer is fighting a two-front war. So Germany can focus its efforts not on the Eastern Front against the Russians, but they can pull those resources to the West. And they hope to very quickly make some progress and gains against the French, against the British in the West. But before Germany is able to make significant or deliver that decisive blow against the Western Front, or on the Western Front, the United States does join the war. So first of all, let's talk about, why does the United States join the war on the side of the Allies? Why didn't they join on the side of the Central Powers? We certainly have a strong ethnic Jewish or ethnic German population in the United States. Well, culturally, if you think about it, the origins of our country, we have strong ties to Great Britain. We have significant relational ties to France. So those ties were ultimately very strong. Also, in 1917, Germany resumed its U-boat attacks, its submarine attacks on shipping that was coming from the United States. And again, this is the U.S. merchant marine by and large, so a lot of these are a lot of these are United States sailors who are on ships carrying goods to France, to Great Britain, and those were attacks that killed Americans. But the real reason, sort of the event that triggers the United States getting into the war, was the interception of something called the Zimmermann Note, or the Zimmermann Telegram. And this proved that Germany was working, in this case, with Mexico, or trying to work with Mexico, against the United States. So here's an actual image of the Zimmermann telegram, and you can see that it's in some kind of code. So this was a telegram that was sent by the German foreign minister, Mr. Zimmermann, to his representative in Mexico, and it was a telegram, it was a message that was going to be conveyed to the Mexican government. And the message to the Mexican government was, hey, Mexico, if you join the war on our side, and you can at least distract the United States to the point where they can't help out here in Europe, once the war is over, the Central Powers will make sure that you regain some of that territory that Mexico lost to the United States, namely Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and parts of California. So the message was, hey, Mexico, keep them occupied while we wrap things up in Europe, and if that happens, then we'll see that you get this territory back for Mexico. So the British were able to intercept the telegram, decode it. It was communicated with U.S. officials and President Woodrow Wilson, and this is really the straw that broke the camel's back, and the U.S. recognizes that it does need to actually jump into the war. So in April 1917, President Wilson goes to the U.S. Congress, because Congress is the only body that can actually declare war. So President Wilson asks the Congress for a declaration of war against Germany, and he receives that. So the U.S. is officially in the war in 1917. Now, one thing to remember, and we'll talk more about it next year, the U.S. at this point was very isolationist. We didn't necessarily want to get involved in Europe, and it took a long time for the U.S. to get involved. We didn't have a very strong military. We had very few men who were trained, who were equipped. So it was going to take some time from April 1917 for the U.S. to build up and to train and to get ready. So it wasn't as if we could immediately send 2 million people over. It's going to take some time. So in this gap between when Russia pulls out of the war and the U.S. gets into the war and is able to send resources and troops over to Europe, Germany is going to try to take advantage and make a big push on the Western Front. So here you can see, remember, April 1917 is when the U.S. declares war, but it's not until the second half of 1918 that we can send significant numbers of troops over to the war. So we don't get to 2 million until the third and fourth quarter of 1918. So there's a significant gap there, and a temporary advantage, at least, for the Germans on the Western Front. One thing I do want to mention, I mentioned the significant German population in the United States, and as you probably know, there's a significant German heritage, German ethnicity in Cincinnati, and there was significant anti-German sentiment during this time. So once the U.S. gets into the war, and here's a sign that you can see in Cincinnati that talks about some of the changes that were made. In Cincinnati, German teachers were fired from public schools. They weren't allowed to teach the German language. German professors at universities were censored. Street names for streets in Cincinnati were Americanized or changed from their German language. Again, trying to, as a reflection of the anti-German sentiment. So by 1918, actually the second half of 1918, we've got 2 million U.S. soldiers joining the troops on the Western Front. And this is enough of a push to get out of that stalemate of trench warfare and reverse any gains that the Germans had achieved. So with that pushback aided by now American troops, the German generals went back to their leader, William II, and shared that the war couldn't be won. William II flees into exile in the Netherlands. Austria-Hungary was already weakened. They were on the verge of collapse. The empire basically fell apart organizationally. Bulgaria and the Ottomans also were at the end of their rope, and they asked the Allies for a peace as well. So with William II gone, the new German government seeks an armistice. And again, an armistice is just an agreement to stop fighting. So an armistice with the Allies, and officially the Great War ends on November 11th, 1918. Now, Woodrow Wilson, again, as we talked about earlier, he was an isolationist. He didn't want to get involved. But once he recognized the U.S. was going to get involved, he had very distinct vision as to what the future of the world should look like. So he came up with what's called his 14 points. So his ideas of what the post-war world will look like. So he's got an idea of what he wants to have happen in whatever resolves the conflict. Now, you certainly don't have to remember all of these, but some of the highlights I want to mention, and we'll spend more time talking about these next year. So in his 14 points, he wants all countries to recognize freedom of the seas. He wants there to be free trade between countries, so no tariffs and restrictions. With this militarism and the military buildup that happened during the war, he wants to have arms reductions. So he wants to have mutual agreements to get rid of some of these weapons. He wants to end secret treaties. So remember, it's these agreements that brought all these other powers into the war that made it transition from a local conflict to an international, world, global conflict. And remember also that secret treaty that Britain had with Italy to switch sides from the Central Powers to the Allies. He also wants to have in the Balkans and those other territories in Eastern Europe self-determination. So he wants those countries to determine for themselves what kind of governments they want, not to have them be mandated to be part of the Austrian Empire or the German Empire or whatever ends up forming in that territory after the war. And maybe most importantly, he wants to have an international organization, an association of member nations that could keep the peace so that we could, through diplomacy, resolve conflict and not have to resort to military and arms to resolve our differences. So very specific, 14 points, specific ideas that Woodrow Wilson has. Again, specifically, here's a chart that recognizes Wilson's 14 points, and you can see some of the things that we mentioned there. And again, number 14 there, the League of Nations, this international organization where countries can, through diplomacy, resolve conflict. All right, I'm going to save the second part of this, making the peace in Paris at the end of the war. One thing I do want to mention, though, before I wrap this video up is, and certainly it's something we're aware of now, is the Spanish flu in 1918, especially in the second half of 1918. So a lot of these troops from the U.S. that are making their way to Europe in the second half of 1918 are taking the flu with them. And much of the spread of the Spanish flu that actually originated in the U.S., we believe, was taken there by U.S. troops as part of the war. Certainly it's going to have a devastating impact, and we'll talk about the impact of the Spanish flu on the world in addition to the casualties coming out of the war in a later section. But just wanted to mention, in this 1918 time frame, we've got the first wave of the Spanish flu that comes through in the spring and early summer, and then the more devastating second wave in October and November of 1918 that, in part, U.S. troops are taking back to Europe or taking over to Europe with them.